You better be listening to Sleazoids or I must break you.
Mr. Jones? Yes. It's about your son, sir. I've got a bit of bad news. Seems he fell off a roof.
You can only on me to do nothing. Knowing what I know now. Don't you see? No, I don't. I bloody well don't.
The matter is, if that young man blows the whistle on it, this entire operation will have been much worse than pointless.
He's coming to dinner, natty dreadlocks. Guess who's coming to dinner?
The Islands.
Yeah, man.
I'm just coming in from
Where the ladies are mighty fine.
Baby,
The life is mighty nice.
Bobby, a brother, trust a brother.
And the law
No, you in trouble, man.
is the mighty Quinn.
You have a license for that?
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare, from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on, and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, which you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
Next week is actually still a mystery to me, but Josh promises me that it's going to be top notch. So join the sleaze.
It is still a mystery. That's right. I forgot to. I need to coordinate that better sometimes. We decide on all the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an on-air shout out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we have been doing for something like 4.5 years. So if you haven't made the jump yet, there are like 110 or more bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series where we talk about new release genre films, which we actually just did one recently on, like Top Gun Maverick, The Northman, Everything Everywhere All at Once. So if you are interested at all in that, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. And speaking of which, we shall give the new patrons their shout out here. We had Johnny Naif, we had Travis King, Matt Nissi, Cole Blake, Barham, Austin Ammer, Punches 2104, Cole Hannon, Austin Sherrode. Are we still going? We are still going. Gordon Brillin, Pelican Grief. That's a good one. Mark Addison, Kaser, Sage Martin, Joe Collins, just Mike, and Chad O'Neill. So thanks so much to you folks for signing up. Hope you are all enjoying those bonus episodes.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as Spotify. You know, I was on the Apple Podcast listeners for like 4 years, but now the Spotify listeners can also rate us. So if you are listening on either one of those platforms, scroll down to the very bottom and give us a good old rating and review down there. It helps us climb the ranks and find new listeners. And the very last plug for the week, as always, is merch. If you like the poster art that based out of Toronto horror artist Trevor Henderson did for the show, you can get that basically put on anything you can think of, and you guys have thought of these things: notebooks, pillows, hoodies, just posters to hang in your house, anything you can think of, at the link in the description if you're interested, as well as over at sleazoidspodcast.com. But that is it for the intro. Welcome back to another week. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, is my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome. I think 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks, free listeners, would have heard from us, and we would have had a very special returning guest on, Violet Lucca, the really awesome critic over at Harper's Magazine and Film Comment. And with her, we broke down some sort of art house existentialism in post-war Japan. We talked Woman in the Dunes from 1964, directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara. His sort of like absurdist horror fable about a guy who has to go to work every day, which is digging sand out of a hole that he is being trapped in, has sort of environmental and a labor aspect to it that's really interesting. And we paired that with Kinji Fukusaku's the director of Battle Royale, his 70s adaptation of a very apocalyptic, almost wartime drama novel that he was very passionate about and sort of informed with his own experiences being drafted as a 15-year-old into the Second World War under Japan.
He's balancing so many tones in that movie. I loved that. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a very psychological, fractured film. It's got full-on decapitations and executions and archival footage of mass starvation that it was experienced by the Japanese. So if you haven't seen that film, it's called Under the Flag of the Rising Sun. It came out in 1972. So we talked both of those with Violet 2 weeks ago. If you haven't heard that episode, go back and check it out. And then last week over on the bonus feed, because everyone is sort of talking about a brand new David Cronenberg film called Crimes of the Future, which we will be covering on the bonus transmission series soon, we decided we would go back and cover the biggest film of his that we hadn't covered yet, which was his 1996 film Crash. Obviously, his techno porn, crazy romance, insanely controversial and erotic, and there was only one movie you could possibly pair that with. Probably not true, but this was a good one to pair it with. We paired it with Paul Verhoeven's Showgirls because we wanted to stick in the realm of controversially erotic, and so we broke down Verhoeven's stab at a sort of glamorous Hollywood satire, but taken to some really depraved exploitation kind of depths. And it was fun watching David and Paul, friends of the pod, get really down and dirty and filthy. And it was a really big episode that we talked over on the bonus feed. So again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast if you're interested in that episode. But moving on to this week, we have a very special guest joining us. He is a contributing editor at The Drift and at Jewish Currents, and his writing can be found in such places as New York Magazine, New York Times, The Baffler, The New Republic. He's also the co-host of a excellent political investigative deep dive podcast called Blowback that I'm sure a lot of our listeners have heard of. And each season tackles a sort of wartime period in American foreign policy, the Iraq War, the Cuban Revolution, and coming soon, I believe, the Korean War and the decades of context that led to and came out of those events. That guest is Noah Kulwin. Noah, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that very accurate introduction.
No problem. I've been trying to research them. I put the work in on those ones, but also it wasn't that hard because I genuinely really do. I don't listen to many podcasts, honestly, I'll be honest, but Blowback is one of the few that I do listen to. It's a really fantastic show that you and Brendan do. And we actually cited it once on our show because we were tackling the films. I don't know if you've heard of them. The films of Ron Ormond and Estes Perkel. They were a duo of a vaudeville magician turned exploitation filmmaker and essentially an insane Deep South Baptist minister and anti-communist crank. And they made together fire and brimstone propaganda recruitment tools in the 60s and 70s, trying to scare Christian children out of watching Looney Tunes and going to drive-ins and having sex.
Oh, that's awesome. I actually collect a lot of pamphlets and old newsletters and magazines. What I would classify broadly as subversive material from both the far right and the far left. And definitely the bizarre cultural mutations that right wing it's anti-communist stuff takes on is wonderful. Brendan and I are both really, really big fans of Tribulation 99 by Craig Baldwin as sort of the most fun and exciting satire of that genre.
Hell yeah. No, I'm going to have to check that out. But I was really taken with because in those films specifically, there's this whole thing about how not only are these kids by doing all this sinning going to bring about hell, but they're literally going to bring about Castro foot soldiers who are going to kidnap, who are going to do an invasion of America and the Deep South and kidnap their kids and brutally torture and murder them by shoving bamboo sticks through their brains and putting them into re-education camps. Well, and it shows all of this graphically.
Yeah, a 10-year-old gets decapitated. It's pretty wild.
And I think, if your listeners like that, then they're gonna love season 3. I'm half kidding. I think that the story of season 3 in the Korean War will talk a lot, or it will speak a lot to the. I think like what you're describing in terms of the sense of like what was this communist threat and how did Americans imagine it? What texture did they give it?
Exactly.
What was the what was the nature of it that Americans described it? How did they describe it to themselves and to one another? And it remains an enduring fascination, to say the least, for myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're interested in how filmmakers and stuff were interested in depicting that, because I've seen ministers talk about that kind of stuff, but to see a real deal exploitation filmmaker like do an entire film of reenactments of it
while you're hearing the sermon itself, like
it really was something.
Yeah, it's
and to have learned from you guys about Operation Peter Pan, where all the American Christians were essentially taking minors from Cuba, and like that's what they were saying they were terrified that Cubans were going to do to them. So it was very interesting.
I strongly recommend your listeners to go watch. It's on YouTube. The film LBJ by Santiago Alvarez, for some really interesting and accessible, Cuban revolutionary Cuban political film and art from that period as well. It's one of the things with the podcast, and Brendan has done some marvelous and exciting stuff with the trailers. But one of the things with the podcast is that we're not there is a fairly limited visual representation going on there. So we don't get a tremendous opportunity outside of like some specific moments, like we've done some movie episodes to plug that, but I would really urge if that's what sort of like that kind of trippy sort of thing floats your boat, but you're looking to see something intelligent and not just fevered behind the camera, Santiago Alvarez is your guy.
Hell yeah, check it out. Well, thanks Noah for joining us, and as I kind of figured by asking you to come on, you were going to give us something in the realm of kind of political thrillers of a certain kind. So, what 2 films have you brought with you this week, and why did you pair them together?
So the 2 films that I brought with me this week are The Whistleblower from 1986 and The Mighty Quinn from 1989. So just for chronology's sake, we'll start with The Whistleblower, I suppose. And I picked The Whistleblower because it is an insanely timely movie. It debuted in theaters in November 1986. That was the same year that, for better or for worse, the Iran-Contra scandal was made public in the United States. Now, the Iran-Contra scandal, to sum it up in about a sentence or two, is effectively a hidden arms for hostages deal. It was a way for Reagan administration and military and intelligence officials to secretly negotiate the exfiltration of hostages held in revolutionary Iran, and to bring them back in exchange for guns that the in exchange for they would buy they paid for the hostages, and then the arms from the deal with the from Iran were routed to Contra rebels, right-wing rebels in Central America. It was basically a convoluted arms dealing scheme under the table. But what it sort of spoke to was this really wild and kind of unseemly military-industrial complex that had gotten out of control, as explained by the fact, as evidenced by my stumble a minute ago there. It was really more than, for the purposes of this conversation, it could be understood as this, one corner of the Tupperware lid, like kind of popping up, revealing, like this like nasty thing inside, which was this, black market of death and drugs and trafficking that was making its way, through Latin America at that time. And, and then, realistically, and in fact, around the world. But that's what came into view that month. And that same month, The Whistleblower, which is a movie about a young intelligence, a young man in this, this world, it is, he dies, and his father, Michael Caine, who is also of this world in this milieu, is supposedly a little bit more of if not himself a World War II vet, a little bit more of the old Britannia spirit. He's sort of forced to, figure out like, well, my son's dead. What do I do about it? And kind of to pick up the pieces and figure out what resulted in his death. And, to me, the most interesting thing about the movie, aside from, like in the context of its release and that timing with Iran-Contra, is just that it's a great example of how movies, really can, like any piece of, great art, they can really reflect and kind of absorb, like a sponge, what's going on in the world, even if you're not relating the specifics of it. This movie was adapted from a novel published a couple years earlier. However, in the UK, this was an incredibly difficult time for manufacturing, and defense contracting and defense contractors were no exception. And this movie is, I think, a really, really fantastic and sort of exciting, way to kind of, get a sidelong glance at this sort of crazy world that for millions of Americans and then, people around the globe who had largely been at the other end of the barrel of that gun. But, Americans were really, they began to wake up to it as something that was really existing. Now, did anything happen as a result of that we could call political accountability? Absolutely not. But I think this movie, and part of what drew me to it was just that it's like, it's so rare that you get something that's really just such an exciting and incisive response to an event that hadn't really even yet happened.
For sure. And the Mighty Quinn is like a little bit, has a little bit more of like a caper kind of sillier quality to it, whereas the Whistleblower is more in the realm of, kind of like the paranoid 70s thrillers that were coming out around that time, as well as kind of, some of the sort of leaner genre fare that was even coming out of the UK that even Michael Caine was in, some of the more sort of brutish roles that he was taking on. So yeah, this double feature is like one of overwhelming forces and characters kind of being awoken to them by kind of like seeing their worlds kind of like fall apart in front of them. The Mighty Quinn obviously having Denzel play a little bit more of a sort of paperback detective kind of character who finds his island being infiltrated by white money and being funneled to anti-communist revolutionaries, and finding himself in a crazy conspiracy like that. But yeah, no, I'm very excited to talk about these two films with you. So let's jump into it. Let's start off here with The Whistleblower.
The world could be made to know.
Their secret world has put out the light of the ordinary world.
What would you believe?
What do you want, Frank?
I'll tell you what I want. I want to believe in England again.
The Whistleblower, a Jeff Reeve production, starring Michael Caine, James Fox, Nigel Havers, Felicity Dean, and John Gielgud. The Whistleblower.
All right, we are talking The Whistleblower, the 1986 British spy thriller directed by one Simon Langton and based on the 1984 novel of the same name by one John Hale, and obviously starring Michael Caine in the central role as what's his name here? His name is Frank Jones, and it also has a supporting cast that includes James Fox, Nigel Havers, and Felicity Dean. And this is interesting because we've talked about Michael Caine, Jamie? I think maybe twice before. We haven't done like his sort of like classic 60s genre films yet. We've kind of talked like more like middle period Michael Caine because he got really big off of doing like heist films like The Italian Jobs. He did like spy films like his Harry Palmer series, including like The Ipcris File and The $1 Billion Brain by Ken Russell. He did like rom-coms like Alfie, and eventually made his way into like war films and thrillers. We did talk about him briefly in Brian De Palma's Dressed to Kill in terms of thrillers. But he was most well known in the UK for his gangster neo-noir films, which this is probably the most sort of connected to in a way, at least in terms of, putting him in kind of like a conspiratorial investigative kind of mode. And he left a really striking impression as a performer in those films. Like Get Carter is one that Jamie and I have both seen that's really excellent.
Very good.
And we've actually covered Mona Lisa as well.
Right. I think that he is like in this movie doing like it's one of my favorite. Maybe it is my favorite Michael Caine performance because
he's really good in this.
It's so unlike any other Michael Caine performance that I had ever seen. It's extremely subdued, and it's basically like if the part where Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon are just doing Michael Caine impressions. It's as if that, except without like the hamminess, it's actually like absorbed, and you just see like, oh, like all of this, like there, like he could if he was really able to like evince this sensitive, hurt side that I didn't expect necessarily from him.
No, yeah, because I'm used to seeing him, at least in his sort of British genre fare, in this period. He was in kind of a more like kind of mean, brutish bastard kind of mode. Like even in films like opposite, like the incredibly angry, barrel-chested short king Bob Hoskins, like Michael Caine came off as kind of like a scary guy when he's playing like the pimps connected to the wealthy clients and everything like that. And in this, he's playing this character of Frank, who is a former Navy man who is kind of just he's meant to be kind of like an everyday guy. He owns a small business. He goes kind of drinking with his Navy buddies, and he just sits back and he's watching and encouraging his son to be this successful linguist for the GCHQ in the UK, intercepting and listening in on Soviet messages in hopes that they will prevent some sort of potential strike as they see it. Yeah, and it's interesting to tell this story from the point of view, though, of his father, who is kind of like this guy who just lives in middle class comfort, and who used to be someone who believed in, who believes in the country, and that statecraft kind of protects this comfort and this middle class life that he's built for him and his son. And over the course of this film, as we'll talk about it, that sensibility for him is just, destroyed as he discovers that, his son who is killed is made expendable for very, very dark and bureaucratic reasons.
Yeah, and he's kind of developed this keep your head down mentality. It does allude to a lot of things in his past where it seems he did see a lot of corruption while he was in the naval force, but just kept on track and kept moving forward, and nothing really affected him too personally. And then it isn't until this devastating moment in his life where his son's taken away from him that he realizes maybe he should stop looking away and look into this a little deeper. Because he's constantly, before this happens, just telling his son, like, you're digging in too deep. You should just stop. Like, mind your business. Just, you have a good job.
And also, my favorite detail is you have a good job. Have you seen the economy right now?
That's like when this movie's coming out in 1980s Britain, this is a few years into Thatcherite reforms, and specifically when it comes to the civil service sector, you have huge layoffs, and especially in terms of bureaucracy. For people with soft skills, there was a real sense in a lot of the literature and the novels and I think the stories of the time kind of reflect that kind of the austerity that is coincident with this rise of like the same kind of transatlantic nouveau riche. And in the case of this movie, it's that, or at least that kind of displacement. It's like, yeah, it's a concern that is very I guess to me, one of the things it's like it feels very it feels like a pretty simple way of establishing some kind of motivation for why somebody stays as part of a criminal enterprise. Except like, what is it? Why is it when that what about when that criminal enterprise is the government? And I think that that's sort of like, to me, always what then is like the thing that then elevates this from like more than just a story about somebody who has an issue with how they make money at their job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this clicked for me when I kind of took a look at Simon Langton's filmography and saw that he was a TV director who was most well known for his adaptation of John le Carré's novel Smiley's People, starring Alec Guinness, which is part of his series. Obviously, his Smiley series that includes like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and I haven't seen that particular series.
Oh,
by
they're
Langton,
marvelous.
I've
they're
heard
the
good
best things ever. They're the best.
Okay, I need to watch them.
They're also on YouTube. You can find them elsewhere. And the first season, the first series of the Tinker Tailor was directed by John Irvin, and John Irvin was he also directed Raw Deal. And
that's right.
Awesome.
I believe he directed.
That's such a funny director for that.
And he also directed Next of Kin with Patrick Swayze, which is another amazing movies, and it is another amazing movie that you got that would fit right in for this podcast. But this movie, basically, The Whistleblower has a very strong parentage. This wine has many tannins.
Yeah, I mean that really clicked for me because I was sitting there going, like we've covered le Carré, I think once on the show. We did an episode on him around the time that he passed, where we talked about The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the Martin Ritt adaptation, as well as The Russia House with Sean Connery playing the British publisher, who kind of gets swept up in the sort of the conspiracy of Soviet scientists and informants and whistleblowers. And so it made sense to me when I was going, okay, I'm starting to see where it is that this came from, because The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was a great introduction for him, because in his specific brand of British espionage storytelling and style, where it was all sort of tradecraft depicted as this deeply tedious and unheroic and kind of soul-sucking endeavor. It's intentionally not very exciting and not very action-packed. It's more interested in being kind of nasty and tragic in a way, and this reminds me of that, mixed with like a little bit of Pakula's kind of like paranoia from the 70s. You got All the President's Men, the parallax view. You throw in some of those sort of like Cloak and Daggers, sort of the mounting cynicism and moral torment, and the shrouded environments and watching eyes and listening ears at every corner. Even in the early scenes in this, when what you think is you're just watching a nice British dad talk to his son about his job, and you're interrupted by scenes of characters like clearly listening in on that conversation, like something very serious is already underway, and the state has already deemed these people dangerous and disposable as part of their webs and their web of plans.
And this is also, there's some, I think, like very, it's important, like the Le Carré reference is important to bring up, because it also is sort of like it, people may want to sort of rush to compare this to something like, say, The Conversation, right? Another movie where like this idea of surveillance and paranoia matters a lot. But I think that, vibes are certainly similar, but I think like a more useful and kind of immediate comparison, at least thematically, that really sheds a lot of light here is, at least in the work of Le Carré, like is the idea of decline and the idea of British decline. And that's something that I think and we'll talk about this in The Mighty Quinn, because it's a very different kind of movie. The thing that makes The Whistleblower so fundamentally a British movie is that it's like, it's about like this declining empire in every sense of the word. Like the more like whatever like morality it had or sense of honor, it's all like all the dignities going away, and it's as in The Long Good Friday, to name another movie of the 80s, it's the goddamn Yanks that are behind it all. The goddamn fucking Yanks. It always is. They're always ready to one up you, etc. So to me, that is like the world that this movie takes place in is to me a very, very real world. Which is so exciting about it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it definitely takes in the very, its central idea is one that is very similar to The Spy Who Came In From the Cold as well. I always think of that very famous line of his, how long can we defend ourselves by methods of this kind and still remain the kind of society that's even worth defending? That is kind of the thing that Frank Jones wakes up to.
Remember how Le Carré through George Smiley gives his own version of what the retort is, which is that, like, how does Carla fuck up or whatever? Mm-hmm. It's that he's a fanatic, and that his fanaticism in the end will be the death of him, or be the end of him. And that's half true. Like, Because in the end, Carla, I mean, at least within the context of Licari's own story, just, actually, I don't want to spoil it because I think it's worth not spoiling. And that's against my rules usually. So I'm letting it be known that is how highly I think of that series. And the books. But all the same, the thing there is that it's like Smiley's answer is that it's like, I'm not a fanatic. Like, we're not fanatics. And it's like part of what you see in Licari's version is that like in Tinker Tailor, who is it that is like the mole-ridden intelligence agency? It's run by this new guy Percy Allaline, who is like again one of these like nouveau riche like enterprising young men, somebody who is not old money. And who is, kind of like, sort of like the Tea Party guy, is like a contemporary political analog in the U.S. would be like, those Tea Party guys with the Ford F-150, except he just has a corncob pipe. And he is, to my mind, like a $80,000 pickup truck or whatever. And he is, I guess the example in The Whistleblower, just advanced a few years, is that what you end up seeing is that actually there are fanatics, and they're not just fanatics about profit, which they always have been, but there is also like a real ideological component to their fanaticism that I think like Licari did not make room for, and this movie does elevate a little bit with the villains that it has by introducing them and really representing them as kind of Thatcherite, which is like and for them if this is like up to 8 on that dial, then like 11 would be the Ken Loach movie Hidden Agenda with Frances McDormand, if you've seen that.
I haven't seen that one,
but
I've heard good things.
Secret Agenda. But yeah, no, I mean, this was very much a current in the water, this idea of like a creepy, surveillance-y heavy British state that was really just like had forgone the public interest a long, long fucking time ago. This is a very cynical public, quite understandably. Her successor, the next government, would fall apart because of illegal arms deals to Iraq. Like, this was a major story of that country at that time.
Yeah, well, and I think it's really interesting, too, that they do confront the kind of... by the time we do get to the reveals and at the end of this film, which we'll get to, but like there is this sort of larger kind of pointless table setting quality to all of the things that we end up when you end up finding out, it's deeply mundane what it is that they were trying to do and what they were trying to cover up, and the results of it were very horrific, which I think just makes it that much kind of worse to a lot of the characters who experience this on the ground, because again, we're following this guy Frank Jones, whose son works for the GCHQ as an intelligence and investigative officer and a linguist translating materials for them. But he starts to get a little uncomfortable when there starts to be a mole hunt underway inside the GCHQ, because there has been, someone who's been working there for 10 years has been revealed to be leaking information to the Russians. And they say, they start turning coworkers and colleagues on each other, saying, you need to watch out who you're working for. You need to not just be paranoid about the things that you're listening to. You need to be paranoid about everything that's happening at your desk, that's happening at your home. And it's not only your jobs that are at risk here, it is the survival of the free world, as they say it, as they operate behind the Iron Curtain. And it's interesting to be dropped into this where his son Bob, played by Nigel Havers, is in the process of, deciding that he doesn't think that he can really handle this work and handle that stress and handle, this whole idea of informing on his friends and sniffing out moles and everyone who's comfortable telling lies. He's very unhappy with his experience, and his father is like, it's a good job though, you can't just like throw that away. And it's interesting to just put it from this very small scale, intimate, domestic perspective that you are dropped into this from, which then starts to ratchet up in tension as his son very clearly keeps getting deeper. He starts becoming obsessed because the way that he sees it is that this sort of culture that they have brewed of paranoia is starting to just ruin things he once found beautiful. I thought that was one of the more powerful kind of writerly elements of it, when he talks about how much he loves the Russian language and he loves literature, and that's why he got into being a linguist in the first place. And he sees Russia as like a world inside his head. And then his perspective on Russian life and is tainted by this war that these two secret worlds are having between each other, where he talks about how when he watches, he overhears conversations of them saying that they're going to use this play from Russia and they're going to use it as a cultural weapon. And then he's like, well, all of a sudden, all I see is the fact that it's a weapon in this secret war. It's not a piece of art, even though, objectively that might be what it is. And I think the line he gets is, their secret world has put out the light of the ordinary world, and our secret world is on the same tack as theirs. Which is a very Le Carre idea, that, these two poisonous forces are kind of just locked in completely attention on each other and have long forgotten any kinds of codes or people or things that they are, actually interested in. It has that sort of moral torment and ambiguity to it that his son is experiencing before he is eventually murdered or jumped or fell by accident or committed suicide. You're kind of left in the dark in a mysterious element for a good portion of the film, but then Frank has to wrestle with that.
Yeah, I guess one of the other things then is the kind of, sort of this idea of like loss or whatever, like the banality of that kind of, or I guess the stupidity of it or whatever, that ends up feeling like the driving force of it. That is a very Le Carre thing, right? Like there is like a sense of like frivolity that runs throughout a lot of his works as well. I guess this movie does, like, upon closer examination, feel like a sort of hidden Le Carre work.
It does. I mean, I was struck because I just so happened to be watching and reading some at the time, and I was like, damn, this is I haven't read John Hale and I haven't read the novel, so I can't say, but I was like, it seems very much like someone found something that was very much written in the vein and might have even molded it to that vein in the adaptation process or something like that. But it's in terms of a lot of the ideas that it's raising, it is surprisingly similar.
Wasn't there an idea?
But again, you could always use more of it.
Wasn't there an idea that you were mentioning that was pretty much the same when it comes to who the mole eventually is and like what his perspective on it is? I think you were. Oh,
his climactic monologue, cribs an exact line from Tinker Tailor. It was an aesthetic choice as much as a moral one is something that the mole says at sort of in the big finale. So it's a very similar idea that is brought up in Tinker Tailor when they eventually discover that mole. But the thing that I do think is slightly different and I do find interesting, because Le Carre was always very focused, and Michael Caine's character technically is like like someone who was part of government work in a way, but usually his characters are they are maneuvering within the larger plans that are taking place. They are actually someone who works in tradecraft. They aren't just like a retired businessman whose son is like, a lowly investigator. I mean, he's not even, this is taking place on a lower rung on the power hierarchy. Which I do think does something interesting for Caine, because I think it makes him feel even more helpless in a lot of different ways. And I liked what Noah was talking about, how he feels, Caine especially, I think, feels kind of subdued in this film. And I think a huge part of that is by making him the character that they did. He's just this very mild-tempered, kind of still man who, used to be on the periphery of the world of government affairs as part of the Navy, but is now content to be kind of like grinding it out like the rest of us and drinking with his old friends and getting excited about a work contract. Like there's a part where, he literally just gets like a deal for word processors to sell to offices, and he's like so ecstatic about that. Like that's not something that a Le Carre character would care about. He would just go home and drink whiskey and think about his own existential crisis. There's something about this character who believes in this middle class life and this opportunity to succeed and be happy and protect this country and protect the order, as they talk about multiple times throughout the film. But and Kane is just really good at like the, you know, as he starts to see the seams tearing, he's very good at this like teary-eyed kind of angry glaring that he does, and still kind of remaining passive and calm in his demeanor, but really revealing this, you know, turmoil and calculation of, you know, experience that he has, and slowly becoming radicalized by the things that he is seeing. Because there is like a journalist character in here who is trying to kind of like expose this, these sort of nefarious forces, and his son obviously is more of an idealist and someone who, you know, was, as they call him, kind of like the young kid who's just like, well, who is he to criticize our methods? You know, how are we the same as what we could be fighting if, you know, we are, you know, that can't be true. You know, so the father has been around long enough that he doesn't quite believe in resistance in the ways that those characters do, and this movie is him slowly coming around to their perspective by seeing this culture of, you know, paranoia and panic and hysteria and death that these people are intentionally and artificially crafting, essentially, to, you know, in the end, literally just kind of save face with the Americans. Like that is literally it. Like that's the darkest element of the whole thing, is that they set up this whole storyline of, we are looking for a mole who is among you. And, you know, there's some successful cross-cutting where they kind of show a guy who they've brought in, who, you know, they start interrogating this guy and imprisoning this guy and people who are related to him. They, you know, a guy gets pushed in front of a subway train very early on, which is like a brutal bit. And, you know, they set up this very low-level mole investigation and intentionally make all of these characters start freaking out and being, you know, scared of each other. And there are scenes where, like, you know, the son starts finding the bodies of his colleagues turning up in like apparent suicides, and some of them are involved in kind of like armed kidnappings. And anytime someone goes to another one and says, I think something's wrong here, like, one of my friends just killed themselves, and all of a sudden the instinct isn't to be like, well, let's work together and figure out what's happening. It's no, go rat on that guy and go say that you think he's the mole now because he's talking. Like, it's creating an atmosphere of suspicion and of sort of nefariousness that is a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point, where then those characters start acting, then they start being like, well, that guy's dangerous and now we need to kill him. And they start piling up all of these bodies as essentially a show. And that element of this I found very bleak and very dark.
Yeah, and there's something to be said about how they're fully willing to take out these people kind of on the lower end of the hierarchy, but the Chapel character, who's the actual mole that is doing the supposed possible damage to national security, they leave him because they can't quite assess the damage that he's done quite yet. So, you know, for these other people,
well, and they don't want it to look bad. They don't want it to be a scandal, right? Because the idea of it being like a high up member of the, you know, the British secret world, being someone who was the mole looks really bad and, you know, really hurts them and exposes them to their allies. So that is why they intentionally kind of work out this this ground level hunt that ends up going really, really wrong for Frank's son, Bob, who finds himself being thrown off his own apartment roof, essentially. But we don't know that for a good portion of the film as Frank kind of investigates this. This was one of the elements I thought was kind of interesting, was how much they relegate and I see kind of why they do it. But they relegate a lot of this action to off screen. Yeah. So that there is kind of like this mysterious element that Frank has to be a part of. Like when he's informed of his son's death, it's something that we had no idea had happened until it, you know, comes up and hits him. And they're just like, we've got some bad news for you. And Kane gets to do the 1,000-yard teary stare while driving. And
it was only 16.
Very bad news. Yeah.
And it's also, I think, the part of what sort of is interesting there, right, is, you know, to give like another example, the Netflix show Wormwood, or says a series by Errol Morris called Wormwood.
Fantastic series.
Right. I'm only bringing it up. I haven't seen it just because I know that most other people have, but it's a way of referencing the story of Frank Wisner, or not Frank Wisner, the other Frank Olson, I think.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, Frank Olson. Always gotta. So, Wormwood concerning the story of Frank Olson, the CIA official who, may or may not have been thrown from a window in New York City. There's a, you could, it's not a common way to die necessarily, but I do think that, part of one of the things that this movie is very good at just evoking, trope after trope after trope of the spy thriller world, not just ripped from like film canon, but also quite literally from history in real life, which was then pretty recent history comparatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the way that this was written. I thought was the strongest element of this, and Kane's performance, I would argue.
Yeah,
as well.
those are.
I think he finds a lot of depth in this role. And I mean, one of my favorite scenes, for example, which I think just has so much pain and history to it that I got really I was very moved by, and also it's just a very dark tense scene, is the scene where he suspects that his old Navy buddy was involved, because he starts investigating this mysterious death of his son, because everyone rules it a accident or a possible suicide, but he thinks that both of those are bullshit, and he's suspicious, and he starts looking into it.
Some of his colleagues won't even discuss it, and which also leads him to be much more suspicious as well.
Yeah, and also, all of the scenes leading up to it where his son was getting deeper and deeper, and he's like, I'm going to talk to this turtle, and, I found this thing, all my movie heroes are American, and, the white guy in the white hat saves the day, and I'm going to keep digging and looking into these people. And he's like, I don't know if you should do that, son. You should, you might get yourself in trouble. And then he's dead. So he starts looking into that, and there's a scene later in the film where he suspects finally that his old Navy buddy, who he really trusted outside the actual work that they did for the government, and he finds out that he was actually used to get into his son's apartment. Because he was a close family friend, and it was a way that they could do it without causing a huge kerfuffle, essentially. And when he wants to basically confirm that and find that out from him, there's this amazing scene where they take a scene from earlier in the film where him and his buddy are both drinking at a pub, just talking about his job, talking about the death of his wife and how his son is doing, and having a very personal conversation. He recreates that scenario at the Navy man's apartment and has drinks with him, and basically gets into a little mini drinking contest with him, where then the filmmaking lets you in on, he's actually drinking water, and he keeps getting his buddy to down more and more vodka. He's trying to get him insanely drunk so that he will actually be honest and truthful and talk to him like he would if they were best friends, and not talk to him as if he was, a colleague who was covering something up and involved in the government. And just watching Michael Caine very clearly be personable and talk to this guy, having a history of friendship with him and warmness with this guy, but also on a mission to get this guy to tell him what he has done. And that scene, I found, especially on Kane's part, just a lot of complicated things happening on his face. As he clearly has affection for this man, he has a history with this man, but also he knows that he is also a pawn in a really, really dark piece of machinery that has killed his son, and he needs to know that, and he needs to get the catharsis out of that. And Caine moves from being incredibly sad to funny and having a good time with him to being incredibly angry and slapping him around a little bit too, like his old gangster roles a little bit as well. And that was an example of just a scene I found very, very interesting and dramatic, because I would say a lot of this film, and in ways that are both good and ways that I did find a little stiff, it's very it does have kind of a TV movie workman quality, so very economical framing, very simple cuts and dissolves, a very few moments of psychological subjectivity. It's a lot more based in these characters kind of sitting around and talking and delivering the very well written characterizations and kind of plotting that they've come up with. But I did find, and also, you know, one could argue that you know, mundanity is also part of the point in a lot of Carré stories as well. But I did find it, you know, not quite as intensely exciting or thrilling in a lot of ways that I do find, say, like Pakula's. Just in terms of the way that it was filmed. I think in terms of the way that it was written and performed, it's very, very strong. But I think that Langton has just more of a kind of very simple, competent approach to it.
Yeah, he's not like smearing the walls than anything there. It's real. I think workman, like you said, is a very good word for it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely moments where I feel, you know, a little bit of more stylized camera work would work, but there are some really cold moments that work with his more kind of like stiff approach, I guess, if you want to say. Like, I really thought just the coldness of when he sees his son laying on the bed dead, when he's like confirming that it's his son. Yeah. Just how it's just so mundane and short. No one really says anything. He just kind of like nods, cries, kisses his son on the forehead, and then moves on to discover.
This is where it's the power of Michael Caine, I think, because it's like and this is, you know, and this is to the credit then of the direction, right? That it is that understated, because it's like, you know, it's not like they don't make it this heightened crazy thing, like, you know, contrast it with just like, to give another, like, you know, body corpse, like father-son scene, although the roles are reversed, Patrick Melrose from the Showtime production. Like, that's, you know, that is just like crazy maximalist an interpretation of that kind of encounter as you could imagine. And this, on the other hand, you know, is like, it understands that the point of this is like, you're going to see Michael Caine cry now. You're going to see Michael Caine shed tears, you know, and...
Absolutely. I think also, you know, it gets by on a lot of some of the writerly detail of it too. Like, there is like really nice sort of written in moments, like, for example, when Caine, after the scene that you were talking about where he goes and he, you know, confirms that it's his son, there's these very nice moments, like, and maybe not even nice, nicely included, but not nice for the character, where he, like, they hand him all of his son's belongings and it's in like a garbage bag, and he just looks at it and he's just like, this is all that my son is now. And he just goes, it's very light. And he's like, wow, you couldn't have put it in like a nice box or something, like, you know, like, what is it? Like, why do you treat me like this? And it continues onto the scene that I think you were referring to earlier, Jamie, where he, you know, he asks what is her name? She is like making the bed at his son's apartment, and it's one of I think it's the section leader Rose. Here it is. Yeah, it's the section leader Rose, who is one of his son's colleagues, and he's trying to talk with her about, you know, like, thank you for like tidying up the room, and she just is basically like, yeah, I can't talk to you or anything to do with Bob. We are ordered not to talk to the press or relatives or basically anyone. He's like, you can't talk to a father about his dead son? Like, you can't say anything comforting to me? And Caine delivering lines like, why is it against national interest to say that you liked my son, or that he was a decent person, or, you know, like, what is this weird, you know, sort of bureaucratic angle to all of this that's just completely dehumanizing? And again, Caine really, really delivers that stuff. And that scene actually also has one of my favorite moments that I think actually is very psychologically subjective, and I think is fantastic, which is when he goes on the roof. When he goes on the roof and he looks down, and he actually does get a brief sort of like fractured in edit of his son, imagining his son hitting the pavement, which is like obviously a really sad moment, but also those insane Dutch angle moments as he observes when he walks in and he's just like, my son's room is wrong, like, it's perfectly clean. That scene was done so well. Like, it's one of my favorite scenes.
I will say that's one of the things where it's like, you know, if you're like a great spy thriller in a lot of ways can be like a great detective novel, or a great like a detective roman. I sort of point to like Jean-Patrick Manchette, the novelist, as to like the like sort of like the apex of how those tales can be kind of kind of crafted immaculately and perfectly and done to perfection. And in this instance, you know, I think that lends itself really perfectly to that. Again, that kind of like TV pacing where you're unraveling something. And although the emotional tension never and the visual splendor is never overwhelming, like you're not like, you know, you could really like, I would not say that you should watch this on your laptop, but it's okay. Like it's not like, you know, this is, like, let me put it this way. It's no Eternals, you know, it's no Avengers Endgame, you know, where you got to get out the, like, you know, 35 millimeter and stuff.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I really love that moment specifically too, because I actually went back and checked it too. It's very well done in the production design and everything too. But like his room is totally fucking wrong, and that just freaks him out. That, again, it's like it's an impersonal thing. It's like this is not my son's room, and they're trying to tell me that he committed suicide or he possibly fell, and this is how he left his room. He hasn't cleaned his room in 20 years.
I also like the little hint.
His books aren't even organized on the shelf correctly. Like, it's nuts.
Right. And when he's talking to Rose, I think when he says thank you for cleaning up the room, she actually tells him straight up that it wasn't her, and that's his first kind of red flag. Like, well, then who would have done it? Because it surely isn't Bob. And so I like that. And I think that's also what kind of initially scares her, is that he's like, well, that seems suspicious. And then something, you know, clicks in her brain, and she's like, well, I can't talk about him at all. I can't say anything. I have to move on. So yeah, I did like that little writer.
Yeah, well, and then he finds the newspaper clippings in his son's jacket that show that, you know, this older woman with a daughter that Bob was interested in seeing. Her husband is the one who they find having committed suicide in the garage, and find out that he was actually a colleague of the convicted spy from the opening of the film, the one that they're trying to say was the 10-year mole. And the other clipping is about the convicted mole's friend, who was the one who, quote unquote, fell under a train, which is not exactly the way that we saw it. So no. These things that Bob was looking into, he decides to kind of continue his mission to kind of get to the bottom of this, and the rest of it does kind of turn into a little bit of a detective story, where he starts getting information out of Cynthia, the girlfriend of Bob. He starts getting interested. He starts talking to a reporter, a journalist, reporter who was interested in talking to Bob, and the reporter, he gets one of my favorite lines in this, where he's trying to explain to and trying to essentially in dialogue radicalize Michael Caine's Frank, because he's like, because Michael Caine can't understand how this thing that he partially committed so much of his own life to, he's like, I don't understand how these 3 murders come back to the government. Why does the government do these things? Like, what's the logic? Like, explain this to me. Mm-hmm. And the reporter basically just points to Watergate and saying that not the actual contents of the scandal itself, but the idea that something could be uncovered like that freaks them out more than anything else. And it just made an already, paranoid group of people whose professional job is telling lies even more paranoid. And I think he calls them like mental patients. They are in a flight from reality, and they have no reason not to overreact. They are incapable of distinguishing between dissent and treason, as both are just like a threat to their order, essentially. Because Frank is sitting here going like, look, I'm like a middle-class liberal Brit. Like, I don't want to tear down a system or be part of a revolution. I
just want to find out what happened to my son.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like, listen, I think that it's, the whistleblower represents like the convergence of 2 great subjects of 20th century cinema, the Cold War and They Killed My Boy.
Right. But yeah, so Caine, over the course of the film, does eventually find out. And I do love that he eventually finds out in this scene that is what I can only describe as he gets taken to the British Eyes Wide Shut house.
Where
definitely. In like the middle of a fancy lad dinner party, they take him, they kind of take a break from it in all their party gear, to essentially explain that his son's tragic death was literally just to cover up what was a covert, like, double-crossing plan to mislead the Americans to the extent of the depth of kind of like the Russian intelligence operatives inside their operations, in hope that they, could continue being allies with the CIA and get, have access to their tools and their equipment and everything like that. And, like, this really upsets Frank for obvious reasons. One, because they are straight up telling you, like, look, there's nothing you can do about this. You can't come forward about this. No one will believe you. We will discredit you. Nothing is going to happen from this.
And we'll go after your family. Or at least
they
Bob's
explain
family.
it very mundanely, that they're just like, this is the way that it is. I don't understand why you're so confused or upset about this. Like, this is just sorry your son died. We're protecting
Things
something
need
bigger.
To be done. Yeah.
Yeah, we're protecting something bigger than your
And
than
this
your
is
son
while
here.
they're
And
whining and dining the American CIA, I think, in the other room as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it all comes back to, like, they created this thing. They created, they kill a guy who they think is a mole, but then they create an atmosphere of distrust, when people in the office, start to act on and start to then eliminate each other. And they essentially start creating traitors out of all of these suspicious circumstances and then killing them and then having to cover up those deaths. It's like, it turns into like this weird Hydra situation where they just keep generating more witnesses and people who are confused and scared, and then, who react to that and then kill them in order to preserve as the quote unquote sort of order. And yeah, the fact that this is how his country is run is something that, is very, very disturbing to him. And I think Kane, once again, getting all the torment and vulnerability out of, feeling genuinely very personally betrayed and radicalized by this thing he patriotically used to believe in, but is now seeing as like this just pointless death machine that it is. And that climax I did find quite striking in terms of the way that it's, again, written and performed. Yeah, but if we are pivoting maybe towards the reductive rating round on The Whistleblower, this one for me, I kind of struggled with it a bit. It's kind of in the very high 3 to kind of like soft 4 territory for me. I did think that it was very, very strong, and I kind of want to give it another shot because I think that Kane is doing something really special here in terms of the way that he is, again, making you feel your way through this character and showing, again, a sort of intimate, domestic kind of ground level view of this thing that you are frequently you see from Le Carré from a little bit more. I mean, not that you don't see it from like a confused perspective in his films, but you do see it from a little bit more of a position of power as those characters kind of wander those really ugly spaces. But the thing kind of holding me back just a little bit was just some of the style of it, because again, I don't think that it's totally off base for someone who is very clearly referencing or homaging in some ways Le Carré. His style, even in his writing and in other adaptations, adheres more to kind of mundane ugliness rather than any, super exciting action. So you could definitely make that argument. But I do find that the best adaptations of him that I've seen, like Spy Who Came In From the Cold, or even the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy that came out, I think, in 2011, they do have a really tense psychological existentialism to them that I find, elevate some of the, more sit down and talk kind of elements that a lot of these have. But again, very well written plot, and Kane brings some depth to that character. Just didn't quite hit me as hard as like All the President's Men or Tinker Tailor, or even the Martin Ritt Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which I think has like one of the bleakest gut punch endings of the 60s with that beautiful shot of the corpses on the fence line and everything like that. But still, very, very strong for sure.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. I really did like it. I'm going to revisit this. I think Kane is a powerhouse in this movie. His subtlety with just the more shattering truth that he discovers is really, really good. There's never really a huge scene of him outbursting or anything. It just seems like he gets just sadder and sadder and more defeated.
Oh, which is so good. I agree.
Yeah.
That's why I give it like a 4 out of 5 for that big reason. I think like elevates it precisely doesn't fall in. It's so easy. It's like a cliche, right? That like somebody goes on a rampage. You expect Michael Caine rampages all the time. No rampage.
Exactly.
Yeah,
4 stars.
Yeah.
Get Carter mode. Exactly.
Yeah, and just like him walking off at the last shot of him, like after saying, I just want
going to that Remembrance Day ceremony
country again, and walking away from the memorial, just in this empty street after the parade. It's heartbreaking. So yeah, I think. I guess some of the style maybe held me back, but I want to revisit it more focused on just the character. And I also like that they spent a lot of time with the son and Caine kind of showing their relationship before.
It's like half the movie before even hits the premise of the kid being killed. You really get into that relationship.
I mean, which is, again, like, to all you aspiring filmmakers and writers out there, that was, as I was watching it, I have looking at my notes from it on my phone. I think I wrote it in some annoying pedantic way like that, where I was like just like this is like it's like yes, like it just makes you feel like invested and give a shit about this, whereas in like in it so often it feels like so expended, whereas here it's like both it helps explicate the plot that unravels in the latter 2/3 of the movie, and it's also like it makes you give a shit about like this like about Michael Caine. It allows you to believe that Michael Caine possesses sadness, true sadness.
Yeah. And then even watching him like pointedly interrogate people through that emotional, sort of experience he's going through too is really strong. Like doing the detective stuff that he's doing, and the final confrontation he gets with the mole, where he makes him write the big confession note out, where in big capital letters he's like, "Capitalism is doomed," his note reads and stuff, and he gets into a little gun altercation with him, where it's just this very old man pulls a gun on him, and he just shoves it back into his chest and it goes off, and he goes back to his Remembrance Day march. But that'll, I think, wrap it up for The Whistleblower. We're going to be right back, and we're going to be talking about the mighty Quinn.
It's staying alive.
Bring in Maui. There's a man out there looking for you who wants you dead. Then I'm glad you got here first.
The best thing we can do is stay out of the way. Denzel Washington is Police Chief Quinn.
I'm in the way.
Robert Townsend is Morby. When there's trouble in paradise, you ain't seen nothing like the mighty Quinn.
All right, we are back, and we are talking about the mighty Quinn, the 1989 American sort of like this one was a genre bender in comparison to The Whistleblower. This one had more of like a noir conspiracy kind of buddy caper quality
There's
to it a
aspects
little
of
bit.
comedy as well, like the way that is it Moby, I think is his name?
Mobby.
The way that he's Mobby, the way that he's presented is pretty comical a lot of the time, honestly. He's getting into like
and it's based on the 1971 detective novel Finding Mobby by an author named Albert Carr. And so it's interesting that he kind of made the main character this Quinn character, and it stars Denzel Washington obviously as the titular mighty Quinn, as well as Robert Townsend, James Fox, and Mimi Rogers, and Emmett Walsh. This one was interesting because it was I didn't have to do a whole lot of research on this director because he didn't really do a whole lot. His name is Karl Schenkel, and he's a Swiss film director whose career is very much a string of very low rent 80s and 90s horror, and a little bit of crime, a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of thrillers in there. But he seems most well known for a movie with Christopher Lambert called Night Moves, which is not the 70s crime film about like night, but like the night, like the warrior, and it's about a serial killer who's like targeting a grandmaster chess tournament or something. Like a chess night.
Sick.
I gotta see that.
But he does have a background in European commercials, which I will say, in comparison to The Whistleblower, gives this a very stylish, like pop music kind of glow and oversaturated 80s sensibility.
And I think
to
that point. So when I look back at movies like this, I tend to look to see if it's old enough. I look to see what Pauline Kael said about it, and then if it's more recent, I look to see what Roger Ebert said about it. Roger Ebert, for what it's worth, loved The Whistleblower, and in talking about Denzel Washington's performance here, quote, in an effortless way that reminds me of Robert Mitchum, Michael Caine, or Sean Connery in the best of the Bond pictures.
There's a connection.
He is able to be tough and gentle at the same time, able to play a hero, and yet not take himself too seriously. Whereas, admittedly in The Whistleblower, Michael Caine takes himself very seriously. But no, it's true. This movie, there's a lot of verve and charm to it. But it also does deal with it's a mystery movie, and Denzel plays an island, cop. But he is, it is also kind of technically an international Cold War political thriller involving international money laundering and political, transnational political corruption. And it comes out in the late 1980s, and it was distributed, by the way, by a mini major, by MGM. To me, it's a very strange movie. I don't understand how it got made and why it's as good as it is, because it's so
you'd think it'd clash with itself more with the tones and just what it's dealing with. It's dealing with some really heavy stuff, but then it has the weird relationship with Denzel and Mobby, and it really focuses on the community with a lot of music and band stuff. There's just a ton of tonal changes that I think.
Well, that ended up being something I really liked about it, because there's because based on who wrote this film, which is it was adapted by Hampton Fancher, whose only other credit at the time was Blade Runner, and the book was written by an economist who was actually a consultant for President Roosevelt and Truman, and mostly wrote books on business and history, including some left-leaning stuff about Cold War, Red Scare hysteria and stuff, but apparently wrote some fiction on the side, and this was actually published after his death in 1971, and it is a Caribbean sort of island set neo-noir that's been adapted here into this very commercial, sweaty, sunny little sort of spy caper buddy action comedy kind of thing.
I'll say up front, disregard Wikipedia claims that this is in Jamaica. Not true. They do a pretty good job in the movie of making it in the novel that it's adapted from an island of indeterminate it's a black island. It's an island largely populated by black people in the Caribbean. Which is meant to give it some liberty in terms of storytelling with what it wants to do, rather than having to be bound to reality.
I think people get confused too, because a lot of the location work was in Jamaica. I think they shot a good portion of the film in Jamaica, so that kind of throws people off a little bit. But yes, they do intentionally try to make it a little bit more broad and kind of vague in that department, which I think is smart, simply because obviously it lets them get away with being a little bit more specific with some of the political things that they might otherwise not want to touch as much if they were making this referencing real geopolitical places. But at the same time, it also spends a lot of the movie and its time just simply soaking up the community and it has these tropical reggae kind of vibes to it, this lush location work that they're doing. It has a tone that has this it has this tone that kind of has a carefree childhood playfulness to it. It wants to get you into this island life and people who have grown up here and people who care about each other and are passionate and kind of lived in. And it wants to give you this as this is a counterpoint to the outside forces. This is why you would want to live here, to get away from the bloody colonial forces that are trying to make their way in and kind of trying to corrupt it in a way, which is what Denzel has to know, because Denzel is someone who operates in both worlds. And I think that that's something that's really interesting, is that it's established that as this character, Quinn, who is the chief of police on this island, he is someone who grew up. Everyone knows who he is. They even sing a song for him, which is very hilariously a cover of the Bob Dylan song, The Mighty Quinn. They just do kind of a reggae updated, and they update some of the lyrics to be about, specific people that he knows and everything like that. But he has a very good relationship with everyone there. He's very charming. He smiles a lot, even when, he's stopping them from hurting each other and he's stopping criminals. He's doing these very cartoonish, roundhouse kick, sweeps and stuff like that, and being now you behave yourselves. And, it's very sweet in a way.
Well, and it's juxtaposed, by the way, against, to me, and this is what's so exciting, is that it's he is the, like sort of like he is of the people, right? Like, like polices them. But, as you guys talked about, like he's mediating that with like these higher all white powers. And it is these conflicts between, and so this is the, if The Whistleblower, it comes out in theaters or it's released initially in November 1986, around when Iran-Contra happens, which I definitely misdescribed it before because it was the arms were diverted to go to the Contras. But you know what? You live and you learn, and you don't try to explain it on the go without having written it down on a piece of paper before you. This is podcasting advice for people in the future.
I couldn't have done it better. It's a very complicated situation.
It's a very, a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have yous. In any event, in this case, though, it's like, okay, Whistleblower is like, sort of about like the pain and the vibes and the gutting out of the country. This is, change the aperture. In 1980, Reagan, or in 1983, Reagan invades Grenada. Manuel Noriega in Panama, his numbers up, etc. The Caribbean and Central America, Mexican Condor is going on at this time as part of the war on drugs. Like there is like this is a hot zone, to use the phrase of the Cold War historian Gerald Horne. And what's very interesting to me is that during the 1980s, a lot of the scandals of that time can be viewed as sort of like intra-ruling class conflict, like different segments and rival sectors of the ruling class, different regional blocks or whatever in the U.S. Are competing against one another and so on, and that includes in colonial ventures. And so when it comes to this island, you now have like the basis for like this, conflict that lives adjacent to this kind of like friendly comic reality that you're describing. And it's and I think to some extent that it's you talked about how this guy was made European, made videos, made music videos, etc. I do think that this is like a difficult movie for like an American to make, because it really is like it's a movie that doesn't have a ton of Americans in it, like but it's really about like the plantation, like somebody who looks at America and like many Europeans do, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a plantation country. Like they had slaves until pretty recently, which is true. Yeah. And so that's, to me, is like sort of like the big like epic kind of subtext to this that is extremely exciting to me. And that it does, and because Denzel is in it too, and like he is at this moment in particular, like Glory's right around this time, right? Like, I mean, to me, he is just like he is Civil War cinema incarnate,
Yeah, Cry Freedom came out before this, which he was nominated for the Oscar, and then Glory, I think, came out the same year, which he was also nominated for. So this kind of came out sandwiched in between two Oscar-nominated star-making turns for Denzel. And I would honestly argue, having seen those, that this is probably more indicative of where his career as a star would eventually go. Like, obviously, he would do things like Malcolm X, and he would do some great stuff in the more serious roles. But the amount of Frank Lucas
is in this role, like you see a lot of you see a lot of like his just like straight up like charm, and like there's a lot of like strange emotional range in this, but
also tough and sensitive and just cool, and it like all at the same time, because again, like he's cool not in like the cold way that like noir and spy movie heroes of old frequently were. Like there's
like
a warmth to him
and excited about things, and
he's so sweaty.
Oh my god, everybody is so sweaty, and
he's eyeing up every woman in sight.
Yeah,
like he's giving a seductive performance.
I love the shot where he's just like the camera's kind of following him along as he's flirting with his estranged wife, and he says something like, "You got a license for that?" and he's talking about her ass and stuff like that. It's just and then he starts to follow her and kind of sing to her and try to get her attention again, and it's just like you can tell that even her as the character has been lost in his charisma before, just as Quinn himself. But Denzel just brings his specific charm to every character, and I loved that sequence in particular.
Oh, and
Oh, go ahead.
Well, one other thing that I think is, really like kind of, special and interesting to me about this whole like, the whole setup or whatever, is that this is a very, this is a movie that like takes, kind of seriously the idea, at least to me, of, what like, how like autonomy like gets represented on screen of like, you know, any group of like, you know, oppressed or subjected people, right? And you get like a pretty limited world presented in the context of this movie because it's a mystery and everything. But, you know, in part because, you know, it has Denzel's charisma and everything attached to it. I really, really do love and appreciate the like, you know, to me, it's just this kind of like, you know, the exciting good humor of it. In particular, like some of these like crazy acrobatics or the song preaching that you're describing, like there's a way to do that would be like, you know, a tragic, corny kind of Romeo and Juliet sort of way. You know, I'm thinking Baz Luhrmann, not Shakespeare. You know, but instead it's like it's like it's something that makes like what ends up being like this extremely bitter truth about like the manipulations of, you know, of like, you know, white men in the North of you know, the United States and you know the CIA. It makes, you know, it makes that conflict not just feel, you know, like, and I say this, you know, as somebody who sort of feels, I guess, kind of steeped in it. It makes it feel not just like a succession of like, you know, guys in suits doing crimes from a windowless room. Like I do think that this is like a kind of movie that actually has quite a fucking bit to say, or at least show in terms of, you know, other sides of the story that aren't just like, you know, yet another movie about Barry Seal or another, you know, drug smuggler or narco trafficker.
Yeah, I mean, like having this very beautiful, again, sort of quality and playfulness with the island life, and seeing so much sort of passion and joy. And there are full-on musical sequences in this that are all fantastic. Yeah. That it really gets you swept up in this to then kind of shock you when you get into the murder and the mysterious elements of this, where the wealthiest man on the island, this man named Donald Pater, who does work in, as they say, offshore corporations, numbered accounts, holding companies, stomping out communism in Latin America. These are all the trades that he operates in. And they find him murdered in his jacuzzi, decapitated. And it is like a pretty gruesome thing where like the jacuzzi is filled with blood, and they find him. And immediately, though, it's suspicious because they don't want an autopsy for the body, both the governor and the guy who runs the resort that the wealthy man was killed in, that all the tourists hang out in who aren't part of the island life. They don't want an autopsy or any investigation or probing of potential witnesses from Denzel, which is, you know, very much weirds him out. He's just like, I'm just doing standard like homicide practices. Like you send the body to the hospital, like, and they're like freaking out at him, being like, no, we know who did it. It's your best friend. It's Moby. And you know, Moby is interesting because he is, you know, he's a childhood friend of his, but someone who like never learned to climb the ranks like he did, because, you know, like people like the governor, who I think he at one point references used to be like a chicken farmer or something like that. Denzel even does like he does little chicken wings at one point, does a little caw at him and stuff. But, you know, he went to school in the US, and I think it's implied that he was like FBI trained before coming back. So there's this quality of like, you know, you kind of have to subscribe to this system to climb it a little bit. And Moby is like a good person, and just never did. But as a result, you know, he's constantly on his back a little bit. He's constantly trying to survive. Like when we first meet him, he's speeding along, having stolen the money that we're going to be looking for the rest of the film. And when he's hanging around, you know, he's challenging people to drinking contests and, you know, running from the cops. And, you know, like his entire life is just, it's fun and it's carefree in a way, and it's filled with so much life, but it's very much something that is, you know, not deemed charming by anyone other than basically the local villagers. Like the actual institutions do not like this character, and basically are using this situation in order to take him down, because they are like, yeah, that's the guy who did it. We would kind of want to get rid of this guy. And it ends up revealing an entire scandal involving, you know, like the wealthy businessman having essentially been like sleeping with native girls and getting them pregnant. And, you know, when they come back for the money, it turns out that he's basically like, no, fuck you and fuck your old mom. And, you know, like all of like just nasty shit. And over the course of the film, he does eventually learn that, you know, these people were just abusing the island and the people. And that was exactly what happened, was that they actually killed him for revenge, and they used like a poisonous snake in order to do it. And I love the story he tells too about the snakes, which was that they were actually imported to the island to dissuade slaves from running away, because the plantation owners didn't want the slaves running away. But what the white plantation owners didn't realize is that the snakes can't tell black from white, is how he describes it. And so they started biting the slavers as well. And so there's a little bit of a poetic angle to it. The fact that the millionaire was killed by the snakes, and the snakes included in the climax too. Which is so funny.
And I also like that he includes that they decided to bring in mongoose, but didn't know that they were nocturnal and the snakes were they would be awake during the daytime.
They operate at different times,
so they couldn't actually take each other out. So it's just an even bigger screw up. I like that it kept just showing how dumb the Americans were being.
Yeah, and then they also introduce what I think is awesome, which is the force that hilariously symbolizes these colonial forces, because you have the CIA guy, who is played by legendary character actor M. Emmett Walsh, who we talked about on Blood Simple, especially with the Coens, but also he was also in Blade Runner too.
To the Blood Simple guy, actually, kind of. He's got this like initially kind of charming, but just kind of gross. But then,
he's kind of just like the fat American doofus, and he's like a tourist, and he's taking photos, also, and that's how he's introduced.
He's like he really does have like a true air of menace, though. Like he's a doofus, but
that's what's interesting. Like they introduce him that way, as like here's a European's idea of what a stupid fat American tourist is like, and then he's revealed to be his Blood Simple, like cold-blooded.
Well, I mean that to me is the
killer.
thing, is that like that's the power. Like that's also what makes this movie good, is that like it doesn't like it's not in part because it's clear who it's rooting, who the movie's rooting for, in a sense. One thing I did want to add that I thought was like really like quite special and interesting was choosing to integrate like the Iran-Contra style storyline with like the funding anti-communists as a like a plot line, an example of the illegality going on in the island. And then also combining it by like having it coexist also with like this like what is pretty clearly like adapted as like kind of like slave rape parable, and putting these things in like the same story on the same continuum of a kind of neo-colonial pain is pretty fucking cool. And also like 1989, not that long ago. Like I think that there have been some movies since that do have like achieve a similar kind of level of like outright political commentary, while also frankly like achieving something like a pretty formally special thing with this like balance of like the comic and the pretty sober minded.
Yeah, I mean, like this is a film where you get like a scene where M. Emmett Walsh is in like a seedy neon red motel where he shoots, like one of the he shoots this guy Patina, who's like one of the guy who was supposed to intercept the money for them, as for the Americans, and it builds up to it musically by having him like stomp on his back and put the gun to his head and tilt up as he fires so that the blood hits his face and everything. Like it's pretty violent. And then it'll go to a scene where like Denzel is trying to flirt with like the resort manager's wife, who is essentially kind of like this femme fatale kind of presence in the film, who he is, trying to resist in a way. But Denzel just, in his, big red Hawaiian shirt and jeans, talking about like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd, and just, there's lots of romantic tension kind of like in the air with this like white, wealthy, kind of like abused woman who has this very kind of old school noir quality to her. And then it'll move into a scene where like he walks into the club, sits down at the piano with, all of the villagers, and just rip out a cover of like a Taj Mahal, like a blues banger, Cakewalk into Town. So, like this is the way that this movie operates. And I think that it's surprisingly not as messy as you would think by like describing that. It is like it has a pretty sustained vibe to it, if not necessarily in terms of tone. And I thought that how this movie related to one that we've covered with Denzel previously was really strong. Devil in a Blue Dress. Carl Franklin.
Oh yeah,
which is a really, really excellent sort of like 90s take on, like a 40s set noir, and, dealing with, how these characters kind of like try to live and love and start a community, and, how proud he is of just owning a house in Devil in a Blue Dress as the kind of like the blue collar detective or blue collar war veteran who eventually becomes a private investigator because none of the white private investigators want to navigate the African American South Central LA community. So there is something that this kind of shares with that, and I thought that would make a good pairing for anyone who hasn't seen Devil in a Blue Dress yet. This was definitely something I thought about while watching this, though this gets, I will say, a lot sillier by the end. Like the fact that you have Emmett Walsh dripped out in like Miami Vice clothes, wielding an Uzi, and helicopters exploding and stuff. Like it,
and
like
this is after
this gets
he kills the village witch in a wheelchair by putting a broomstick in the chairs and then setting her house on fire. So it's,
and the tracking shot of Denzel like arriving with like the house on fire and everything, like it's very like it's strange. It has like that 80s over the top kind of action quality that it eventually gets to, but what is crazy is that it does that while also having like hinting at all of these very serious political themes, and having some very impassioned characterizations and performances at a certain point. Like, so I don't think it gives them a lot of character in the writing, but especially just like stuff like with Moby, for example. Like I do think that it's so funny how few scenes we kind of get of them together. Although there is one where, as childhood friends, they get together in the car under tense circumstances and they drink together, which is another connection for Noah, for the whistleblower, where you have two old friends getting drunk because they have found themselves in an insane conspiracy that's way bigger than them.
Yeah.
But with the sequence on the beach, and also when they go to the ancient ruins and they start like just fighting one another.
That's the part to me is like
dance fight style.
Oh yeah, it's like, I mean, listen, it's like
I can't
it's
remember
proto. It is like proto island, like it's like Calypso gun kata. It's amazing. It rocks.
Yeah, it's very cool looking. But it does, like, once again with just the tones, you would think that it would be a fight, and then you see this style, and there is kind of like I don't even know if you want to call it a silliness, but a more lightheartedness than you would expect as he's telling the story about his, girlfriend essentially being raped and impregnated by the millionaire luxury resort hotel owner. And this is where he starts to express what happened, where they tried to get him through a snake bite, and then afterwards cut his head off to make it look like it was something else. And it's just, I did find it a little wild to have that being explained while they're doing this kind of style in dance, but fighting, but it still works with their relationship. The thing that I got a little bit confused by was when Emmett shows up and he's got the gun to Quinn, and it looks like he shoots, but then nothing happens to Quinn, and then he kicks the gun, and Emmett points the gun back at him, but never shoots again. And it felt, did you guys feel a little confused by the logistics of the action just in that moment?
Absolutely. But however, I decided, I will confess that I chalked that one up to movie magic.
Absolutely. Hey, no problem with that. No.
Yeah. It always comes back to
was the movie magic,
but yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so it has a big crazy set piece where all of this kind of comes to a fold. Helicopters are exploding, snakes are popping out of money bags and biting pilots in like their legs, and huge 80s action, and Denzel having kind of found out what it was that was happening on his island, and having killed basically everyone who was involved in it, goes home soaking wet in the rain, mourning his childhood friend, and he restores his relationship with his wife. And I do find it the moment where he like falls from the door frame into bed with her in the silk sheets, and then starts going
call
back
to another great Denzel role of that vein, ending of Inside Man.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I mean, this honestly feels like the prototypical like Denzel Washington, crime thriller in a way. Like you feel like the structure of this was used like probably like 10 or 15 more times, and it was always a good movie. You can't go wrong with
totally.
this.
It throws out a stone. So in the I do got to run now, but so I want to do some reduction. I want to do some reductive ratings.
Yeah, for sure. So pivoting towards a reductive rating round, this one was in the similar boat to the Whistleblower for me, but also once again, very, very strong 3, almost soft 4 for me, where I was like, for me, I think that, considering the politics hinted at in the climactic developments and the fact that the Blade Runner writer is involved here, this was a surprisingly kind of like light affair for me, but not necessarily a knock against the movie, because it is fun to see the CIA's anti-communist plots in Latin America, defeated by some hilarious roundhouse kick sweeps.
Listen,
and
they failed
snakes
more
jumping
often
out of
than
helicopters.
Succeeded, we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah. And it's incredibly charming and colorful and like musical as a film overall. Again, the great sort of like reggae soundtrack, beautiful colors, awesome Jamaican location work they do, the lush jungles and plants and everything. It has a lot of personality, and it really does have this regional folk quality to it, making this community come alive in its style versus the pristine white mansion resorts and the money and the people who fly out just to basically do whatever they want, kill whoever they want, fuck the native girls, like that kind of aspect. And I do think that this guy had a decent amount of style. There's some nice off-kilter wide angles to it, and it really soaks in the surroundings, and slow-mo during the action, and it's a very wet movie, very shadowy movie, and so this is a very wet and alive film considering how silly it kind of gets at times. And
I give it a solid. To me, it's a strong ass 4, and it is one of my favorite of all time Denzel performances. I love it.
Yeah, for you, James.
Strong 3, but I'm also going to revisit this again. Really think Denzel's great. Love the focus on community and just very colorful film that I loved. Just the look, the location work was really awesome. Just every location they shot was beautiful. A little bit confused with some of the tonal changes, but I think for the most part they work. And again, the logistics of the final thing between Quinn and Emmett seemed a little confusing, but I still got a kick out of the snake biting the helicopter pilot and exploding into the ancient ruins and all that. So I had a good time with that. And I also, last thing, I did kind of like how Mobby, he almost has this like ghostly feature to him a bit. He doesn't appear a lot in the film, but when he does, he just kind of appears and then quickly disappears. Even the way
Robert Townsend.
I was about to say that's
Robert.
That's the magic of Robert Townsend, man. Yeah, and the writing, and also he's like an ethereal dude.
Yeah, like even the way they used it several times with the footsteps out of the ocean when, like, even at the end when you think he's dead, but maybe he left them the $10,000 bill, all of that. So yeah, I thought that was cool too.
Also, by the way, like the diamond that Denzel finds in Inside Man, just saying.
Yeah, and the last two things I wanted to bring up is that you really, with the community stuff, you really see why he loves this place, which reminded me a lot of the Carl Franklin film Devil in a Blue Dress, where, he wants to preserve this place in the face of white power and money and political corruption. But I think in comparison to that film, which makes that tension between him and colonial forces kind of like more existential and his sort of mobile fight upwards out of his class despair, they make that really palpable. And I think this ultimately just gets a little bit light and a little bit silly, and it leans into its kind of like Miami Vice villain of the week kind of climax stuff. And it's just not as deeply emotionally felt as, say, like the bleak race relations realities and the impending doom of real estate development in South Central LA as Devil is.
Yeah.
But I'd say that the script is pretty lean, and Denzel is, he's really incredible, and he really elevates a character that might not have had some real shades of depth to him. And, similar to Michael Caine in The Whistleblower. And, just the way that he sexily eyes up a woman or has painfully long glances, remembering when this place was a lovely, wonderful, playful place with his friends, and, not a place for creepy, murderous money men. And, and the very last thing I wanted to bring up before we wrapped up was the name of this film was obviously derived from the name of a Bob Dylan song, and in his autobiography, which I saw a couple people bring up, and in his memoirs, he had a great thing that he actually did end up seeing this movie at one point because it was named after his song, and he wanted to see what that was up. So he said, in his memoir, he says, on the way back to the house, I passed the local movie theater on Britannia Street where The Mighty Quinn was showing. Years earlier, I had written a song called The Mighty Quinn, which was a hit in England, and I wondered what the movie was about. Eventually, I'd sneak off and go there to see it. It was a mystery, suspense, Jamaican thriller with Denzel Washington as the mighty Xavier Quinn, a detective who solves crimes. Funny, that's the way I always imagined him when I wrote the song The Mighty Quinn, Denzel Washington. He must have been a fan.
That's awesome.
So yeah, Bob Dylan must have been a surreal thing to see something called The Mighty Quinn, go in and watch it, and they like do a reggae cover of your song in the film, and they like change the lyrics to like match the story and everything. But yeah, either way, very cool.
Yeah. The last thing that I'll mention too is I do find it a little strange just in tone where what we find out happened with Mobby and his girlfriend is pretty disgusting and
pretty horrifying.
Pretty horrifying. And it just seems like the tone of the reveal and just the overall character, especially what he had to do, which is, kill a man and then decapitate his dead body to hide the reason for the killing or the way that he was killed. I just feel like the character should have been dealing with maybe a little bit more ghosts from his past. I'm not saying that, it's like I understand why they were put in the position they were in, but I still think that someone that would have to be driven to do that would have to deal with that a little harsher, I guess, just on a personal level.
It definitely does very sometimes clumsily lurch from like the fun, sweaty 80s workout covers of like Bob Marley to, like a dude being, viciously decapitated or executed or, and obviously bringing up these really horrifying politics. So it definitely, there's a couple things get crossed, I think, while you're watching it. But again, very... I think the style does surprisingly kind of overpower some of those elements where you kind of just go along with it and kind of have fun with it.
Before you go, I just wanted to plug season 3 of Blowback. It comes out in July. If you want to subscribe and pre-order it, we're selling the season now. You get the whole season all at once. And we're going to be releasing it, on a weekly basis for free, like we've done in the past later on. But if you want to get it all at once in July, it's $25. Go to blowback.supportingcast.fm. That's blowback.supportingcast.fm. We're going to have an original score, like all the goodies that we had last season and more. We're really, really, really excited, and you'll be able to listen to the podcast on whatever is your preferred podcast listening platform. Josh and Jamie, thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad I got to talk about two of my
thanks
favorite.
for coming. That's going to wrap it up for this week. That was The Whistleblower 1986 and The Mighty Quinn from 1989. Thanks so much, Noah, for
my pleasure. This was a blast.
For talking about these films with us. For our listeners, in 1 week's time, we are going to be back with a bonus episode exclusively over on the Patreon, where we are going to be doing a big episode that I forgot to tell Jamie I was plugging in. We are going to be doing Brian De Palma's Blowout from 1982, an episode, a movie I've wanted to cover on the show for many, many years, and I actually was lucky enough to show Jamie on the Criterion Blu-ray for his first watch and watch his mind be expanded by
big old five.
By that last scene. Yeah, it was that meme of dropping the Insta 5 like as fast as possible on Letterboxd. That was Jamie's reaction. So we're going to be talking about Brian De Palma's masterpiece Blowout, one of the like big last Brian De Palmas we haven't talked about.
And such a good Travolta performance too.
Yeah, so good. And we're going to be pairing it with a film I haven't seen, but I heard very much connects to Blowout in an interesting way, I think, to do with kind of like the artist as the investigator or the killer, and a little bit of he's a sound engineer and special effects. I think he deals in actually making movies, might even be in the special effects department. I don't know, I'll have to wait and see. But the movie is called Special Effects. and I believe
Nice.
I can't remember if it's 84, 85, but it's Larry Cohen, and it's actually the very last Larry Cohen directed film that I haven't seen.
Oh, wow. Nice.
I've been saving it specifically for this episode. So yeah, we're going to be talking about 2 show favorites: Brian De Palma, Larry Cohen, Blowout, special effects. Patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. That's going to be next week's bonus episode. It's probably going to be a big boy. And then in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be back with a special guest where we're going to be going classics mode. We're going to be remembering some classics. We're going to be talking about 12 Angry Men.
Oh,
perhaps
cool.
you've heard of it. Perhaps you've seen it. Perhaps you've read it. You know, it's pretty much everyone has heard of 12 Angry Men. So we're going to be going courtroom drama mode a little bit on that one. But we're going to be pairing it with another sort of film that interrogates kind of mob mentality and the idea of justice and the death penalty and violence. We're going to be talking about a Western that way predates 12 Angry Men called The Oxbow Incident, which, if I recall correctly, is a William Wellman film, I believe.
I think I've had this on my list for a bit, so that's exciting.
Yeah, it's a 1943 Western.
Mm-hmm.
It's starring Henry Fonda, and it is just awesome. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about we're gonna be talking about some sort of philosophical morality tales done in classic American genres. That's what we're gonna be doing in 2 weeks' time, and it's gonna lead us into maybe a couple more Western conversations.
Ooh.
Small little hint there. We might be going Western mode for a little bit. But yeah, thanks so much as always for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy.